time traveler's wife. Claire shows that she's been waiting long enough, and after having Henry meet her friends, her family, she decides it's now time to get married. And Henry, throughout the episode, we see him struggle with trying to not only live up to the Henry that she wants him to be, but also deal with everything regarding this major moment and not perhaps jumping to the past or future in order to escape all the anxiety he's dealing with. So to begin, with Claire and Henry getting married, so comes a need of Claire needing to meet Henry's father, Richard. Now, it isn't clear how long it's been since Richard and Henry have spoken, but you can tell they're definitely estranged but aware of each other. So with that in mind, Richard is glad to see Henry, and Henry is cordial toward his father. But thankfully, while Henry is still a bit weird about things because, there's a third person missing from their dynamic, Claire and Richard are able to bond, and with that, Richard opens up a little bit. Henry's able to kind of cool down when it comes to his, I wouldn't call it indifference, but it's definitely this sort of awkwardness that you can tell he doesn't want to really push through. And him allowing Claire to kind of bring him back into the fold and kind of becoming that third when it comes to the relationship allows Richard and Henry to start healing after all that has happened, but unfortunately goes unsaid in this episode. Getting into the second topic, as the weeks go by and Claire's trying to get all the wedding stuff together, Henry goes from doing jumps every now and again to almost every week to almost every day. And then when he goes sees an associate of his named Ben, he takes some type of drug, and it makes it so that Henry is pretty much jumping on a constant basis. And the thing is, when Henry jumps, it's like 2 minutes to him, or maybe 15 or so. But when it comes to everybody else, he's gone for like hours and days sometimes. And that becomes very stressful for Ben because, while he's aware of the time travel thing, he has Gomez skulking around and then banging on his door, which is bringing attention to him, which Ben doesn't like because he has this huge, we'll call it huge. He has this huge drug setup in his kitchen, which of course you don't want cops or anybody from the neighborhood, which based off of the way Gomez and Henry talks about is a bit seedy, having the need to poke around and see what's happening. So Gomez becomes involved, Richard becomes involved when things get really kind of strange. And in terms of what's happening with Claire, Claire up to this point has seen Henry go off and on throughout the night, throughout the day, and with that in mind, she understands that he's kind of anxious, and with him not talking about where he's going or what he's seeing, she has enough emotional intelligence to know that maybe she should just back off and let him try to figure things out. Because no matter how you slice it, yes, Claire has known Henry for most of her life, but she's just now really getting in bed with him, no pun intended, in regards to really understanding what it means for him to be a time traveler. So comes the question of how did the wedding day go, and let's just say it's a bit complicated. The good part is Claire does walk down the aisle and she marries Henry. What makes things complicated though is she gets married to 36-year-old Henry, who, all things considered, is her true love, is the true love of her life, so that's not bad. But in terms of 28-year-old Henry, he ends up in the future and he learns a lot of stuff that makes you understand why throughout the episode there's been a question of whether or not Henry and Claire remain married. First and foremost, Claire has had at least 5 miscarriages, all because the baby that she conceives with Henry, they're a time traveler and they keep time traveling out the womb. Now, based off of what we learned thus far, it's kind of confusing how the baby's time traveling and where they're going, because mostly everything that we've saw Henry jump through usually deals with some type of memory he was told or his memory he experienced. So with that in mind, in this baby, where exactly is this baby going and how? Never mind, when he is under Ben's drugs, Henry sees some child that is not someone we can identify, and so comes the question of, is that child Henry's and Claire's after they've jumped many times? And if that's so, how did they survive? Since the way that Claire makes it seems, the baby doesn't get far enough to come to term in order to perhaps live. But that's a whole different story. The point is, 36-year-old Henry, he decided to get a vasectomy after Claire had her fifth miscarriage. And with that, 29-year-old Claire is very upset with him, and that could potentially be one of the reasons why she divorces him and they end up talking like they're not married. But in terms of that girl, we just talk about the little one that Henry saw when he was under drugs coming out of the house that he shares with Claire. Claire's mind is like, when she sees 29-year-old Henry, when 29-year-old Claire sees 28-year-old Henry, her mind is like, you haven't been snipped yet. You can possibly give me a baby. And to make matters all the more better for Henry for the first time in this whole scenario, this Claire, this 29-year-old Claire, she likes him for him. She likes who he is and even apologizes for changing him, considering all that craziness and all the hair he had and all that. She seems to miss that now and realize she didn't truly appreciate it back when she was 20 years old. So with that in mind, Claire on her wedding day got the man that she loved and wanted, and Henry finally got the version of Claire that could actually be someone he could love and feel secure in his relationship with. So win-win situation. So the first highlight for us is just Claire and Henry getting who they wanted. Claire has been forever trying to mold this 28 version of Henry into this 36-year-old version of himself. And as we've seen throughout the last few episodes, especially after the introduction of Ingrid, Claire doesn't really want this Henry. She's just waiting her time for him to become the man that she loves, and Henry has really pushed himself to do that. He cut off his hair, he seems to have become a bit more submissive when it comes to Claire and her desires, and it's kind of sad to see in a way, since you can tell at one time, especially with Ingrid, he was very much part of the conversation. He was going back and forth with his partner, and you can see there was real passion there, rather than Henry just kind of going along with fate, because at the end of the day, Claire seems to be the only one who's going to bring him any kind of happiness amongst all of him, amongst him jumping back and forth through time, naked, vulnerable, and him knowing that it's going to come times where it's going to get real violent and painful, and the only promise of any type of good times is through this woman. But in a way, you can kind of see it as poetic that Claire on her wedding day got the man she wanted, and when it comes to Henry, he finally got somebody who didn't make it seem like he was stuck to fate and just had to accept it and hope for the best, but actually got somebody who made him feel loved, and even made who he was as a 28-year-old person actually feel loved, adored, and appreciated. And with that, you can see, even though they have had issues throughout this whole story about them loving different ages of themselves, or each other for that matter, I think Henry, even though he feels kind of uncomfortable with 29-year-old Claire, he may start romanticizing her the same way that Claire has romanticized the 36-year-old version of himself, since this Claire is the kind of person who he's probably longed for, but unlike Claire, hasn't had built up in his fantasies for 14 some odd years. So in the written review, this was a highlight, but now I'm gonna probably make it an on the fence topic, and that is just how this episode furthers the storyline between Richard, Henry, and their relationship. Now, the reason why this is a highlight is because there's a lot about Henry we don't know, and because the show is called The Time Traveler's Wife, there's a lot that we probably won't know, because as much as Henry's part of the interviews when we see the recordings, at the end of the day, this is Claire's story, and I feel like a lot of what we're gonna get told or shown is gonna be from Claire's point of view, or us what Claire knows about. So with that, seeing Henry and Richard interact, that allowed us to get some type of clue of what the dynamic is, and it's clear that because Annette's not part of that dynamic, that's why the two are distant. They don't know how to connect as father and son without her there, and of course that leaves a few questions, like, for example, what was the relationship like when Annette was around, and after that happened, what is the thing that really put a strain on them besides her death? Why didn't they come together in trauma, as I think Claire asked him about a long time ago? Is it that, even though it's not shown in this episode, did Richard ask of Henry to try to fix the problem and save his mom? And he couldn't, and that's kind of what led to a bit of an impasse between them and some animosity, maybe? Is it that because Richard kind of withdrew and then became an alcoholic, that's the reason why they have so many issues that, for the most part, go unsaid? There's a lot of things that aren't answered in this episode, and it's just kind of frustrating in a way, because you could even go into, when it comes to Henry and Claire and the relationships he had before her, which I think we mentioned in the last recap review. It's like we have so much that goes unanswered when it comes to this episode, which, depending on where you go, is either called the season finale or this HBO ad showed it as a series finale. So it's just like, this does not feel like a finale. It barely even feels like a mid-season finale. It seems like it should be just like middle of a season instead of the last episode, and that's where the on the fence part comes in, because as this animated way I'm talking is showing, it's really frustrating that this is where we're ending at, considering all that's left to cover. Overall, when it comes to the time traveler's wife, I just feel with this final episode that it doesn't feel like it has an exclamation point on it. Rather, it feels like a terrible version of an ellipsis where we should be able to keep going without having to wait perhaps a whole year, but unfortunately we're now stuck in this limbo of waiting to see if HBO renews this, whether or not this is truly the series finale, and then just going to stop it here, or what.